In Genesis chapter 13, starting in verse number 8, we read thus from the CSB. So Abram said to Lot, "Please let's not have quarreling between us, between you and me, or between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, since we are relatives. Isn't the whole land before you? Separate from me. If you go to the left, I will go to the right. If you go to the right, I will go to the left." Lot looked out and saw that the entire plain of the Jordan, as far as Zoar, was well watered everywhere, like the Lord's garden, and the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose the entire plain of the Jordan for himself. Then Lot journeyed eastward, and they separated from each other. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, but Lot lived in the cities of the plain and set his tent up near Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were evil, sinning immensely against the Lord. After Lot had separated from him, the Lord said to Abram, "Look from the place where you are, look north and south, east and west, for I will give you and your offspring forever all the land that you see. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust of the earth, then your offspring could be counted. Get up and walk around the land, through its length and width, for I will give it to you." So Abram moved his tent and went near the oaks of Mamre at Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. This is a familiar story to most of us. The idea of Abram and Lot, these kinsmen, fighting over the land, essentially, although Abram and Lot themselves did not fight. Their herdsmen did. God had blessed them so much they could not live in the same area. And Lot made a choice. Abram encouraged him to make a choice, and this is the choice that he made. He chose a place that was well watered, and it was like the garden of God. And it's an interesting double reference, actually, to Genesis chapter 2. The word Eden in our text, the name for God's paradise that he provided for Adam and Eve in the first place, means a well-watered place. Which, if you know the story of Eden, you know that that's the case. 4 different rivers flowed into the Garden of Eden, the text says. That's about as well-watered as it gets, I suppose. And so when Lot sees this paradise, essentially, at least it must have seemed like a paradise in comparison to other places, this is what he chose. He chose the place that had a great deal of water. Well, that's a reasonable choice. That's an informed choice. Water's better than no water, or little water. But the problem is, of course, that this well-watered place was in the area of Sodom and Gomorrah. And I find it interesting that Moses, whoever's writing this record down here initially, indicates for the benefit of his readers, who must have been scratching their heads a bit at this description of this part of the world, said specifically, this was before God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. If you're reading this in the days of Moses, or the days even prior to Moses somewhat, the days of Jacob and his family, you read this record and you say, I have been to the area south of Canaan. I've been to that area that the Lord is talking about, and it is not a well-watered place. It is a disaster, in fact. It is a wasteland. Well, this was before God was done with it, and he emphasizes that for the benefit of the reader. We're going to get to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, of course, a few chapters later. But for now, we dwell briefly on how wonderful the place was. It seemed like a paradise to Lot, and this is what he chose. And what we see in this choice between no water and water, between wilderness, essentially, and a well-watered place, we see a choice of faith, essentially. We see a decision being made that demonstrates a presence or a lack of faith. And what I want to do here briefly today is describe the difference between the Eden that God provides and the Eden that we see in the world before us. This is essentially a choice of lifestyle. Abram is living his life in faith. And it's worth noting here that at the conclusion of this negotiation, Abram is told he's going to get all of it. It's not a matter of you go this way and I go that way. Everything within view, everything in this part of the world belongs to Abraham, or Abram as he's known at this time. So this is clearly a good choice. Abram chooses by faith, and because he's a person of faith, he receives this immense inheritance. Lot chooses the reasonable short-term choice, and it winds up being a disaster to his family. Most of you probably know the story already. We won't get into that in depth here today. Sodom is a well-watered area. It is going to assure the shepherd, it's going to assure Lot, whoever lives there, of quick and easy results. That's what we like in this world, that we like something that's going to work right away. It simplifies our planning considerably. We don't have to worry about what it's going to look like at some point in the future. We know what it looks like now. That's not necessarily a guarantee of long-term results by any means, but it's better than nothing. And Lot sees that, and Lot acts with wisdom as far as that goes. But Abraham makes a better choice. Abraham makes a choice of faith. And again, this isn't just what territory you want to live in. This is a lifestyle choice. There is something to be said for the idea of hard work. The idea that working hard by the sweat of our brow, striving towards some kind of greater goal that may be difficult to achieve, that is inherently a good and noble thing. I think all of us instinctively would rather take the short route to success. But so many times in the Bible, we see that that is a recipe for disaster. God is not trying to help us avoid work in this life. He is trying to give us profitable work, and such has always been the case, even in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve were given profitable work to do, and we are given profitable work to do also. And when we are able to engage in this world, to live our lives by faith, to work hard, to avoid bad company. Solomon's writings is all about this. Ecclesiastes is work hard where you happen to be. Find contentment there. That's what we do as people of faith. And as people of faith, we are, all things being considered, all things being equal, we will try to avoid the place that will get us into long-term trouble. And that's what Sodom is. That's what Sodom represents here. That's what Sodom becomes to Lot and his family. It's not just a matter of finding the greenest ground. What are you going to encounter besides green ground there? You're going to encounter Sodom. You're going to encounter the people of Sodom. And in fact, in that very text, the text talks about Lot living in Sodom. Well, perhaps not living in Sodom exactly. He's living towards Sodom. He pitches his tents towards Sodom. But he's chosen this particular area that he knows is affiliated with Sodom. And if he is not spending his weekends in town at that point, it doesn't take long for him to be doing so. Before too long, he is described as living in Sodom. He's sitting in the gates of Sodom, which indicates that he's part of society there in Sodom. He has been accepted, at least to a certain degree, by the people there. Now, does that necessarily involve a compromise of your morals, of your dignity, of your faith? No, not necessarily, because 2 Peter chapter 2 makes it clear that Lot is a man of integrity, but it certainly affects his family. There's no question about that. And it gives us pause when we consider how this easy choice, the choice that seems to make all the sense in the world in the short term, winds up being a stumbling block for us. Walking by faith, having confidence in God's long-term plan, is a better way to do this. Clearly, Abram makes the better choice. What we need to appreciate as we are temporary residents, and the shepherding culture of Abram and Lot is so wonderful with regard to such things, because they live their lives wherever life happens to take them, of course, in the moment. And we are not really that much different. Any resident of Earth is a temporary resident, a resident alien, essentially, is how they are described in various translations in this text. They are living in somebody else's land. They're just traveling here and there. They don't have citizenship. They just happen to be in that particular place at that particular time for some period of time. That's who all of us are here on planet Earth. We are all temporary residents. We are all resident aliens in the land. And because of that, it's a mistake for us to invest too heavily in this life, for us to put down roots that are too deep. And I realize that that goes against every fiber of our being. And I realize that there are certain long-term investments, or what seem on planet Earth anyway to be long-term investments, retirement accounts and buying a house and that kind of thing, that would seem to make some sense. And that's not necessarily a problem. But when we are storing up treasures on the earth, instead of storing up treasures in heaven, we set ourselves up for disaster in this life. What we need to do instead is appreciate the value of the spiritual choices God wants us to be making. Realize that every choice that we make here in the flesh has some degree of spiritual consequences. It may be a relatively light thing. Where are you going to have dinner? Who's your best friend going to be? Who are you going to marry? Where are you going to go to college? Where are you going to live? All of these things have profound impact on spiritual things, especially the company that we choose for ourselves. So what we need to do is look to these lessons of the past. Look to what happened when people made physical choices that negatively impacted their spiritual choices. These things are given to us as examples, the text says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, that we do not walk as they walked. We make better choices than they did. It's so much easier sometimes for us to look at negative examples. And that's the point of the first part of 1 Corinthians chapter 10 there. Look at these disasters that people made for themselves. I don't want to do that. I don't want to wind up where they wound up. I don't want to be afflicted by plagues and destruction as they were. I'll make a different choice. I'll make a better choice. It seems like Lot did pretty well for himself in this bargain. In reality, of course, he doesn't. Lot goes down as the person who was witness to the destruction of Sodom, the one who lost his wife, becoming a pillar of salt, the one who had that strange incident with his daughters. Lot becomes, if not a laughing stock, at least a magnet for disaster. And it all begins with this choice. It all begins with putting physical things ahead of spiritual things. Do not be deluded by present circumstances. Do not think that just because everything is going well for you right now, that means everything is going well for you. Because there are spiritual ramifications that oftentimes are not seen very well, sometimes aren't seen very well at all, and oftentimes are counter to the physical blessings. I think this is why Agur tells Solomon and tells us, because Solomon records his words in Proverbs 30, verses 7 through 9, that this is his request. He doesn't want poverty or riches. He doesn't want to be overly rich. He doesn't want to be overly poor. He wants his lifestyle not to be defined by how much he has or how much he does not have. Being content in the middle, if you will, is a good way for us to remind ourselves that ultimately spiritual things are more important. It's not about getting out of this hole that we find ourselves in. It's not about making sure that we never fall into the hole. It's about making sure that God is the focus of our existence at all times. We as spiritual beings embrace the future that God has for us. We embrace the idea that God is taking care of us. Abram's willingness to give this choice up has been commented on by many, many preachers over the years, and it's appropriate. Abram says, whatever you choose is fine. I'll take the other. Because Abram realizes in this moment of faith, sometimes he has his moments of weakness, but here clearly he has a moment of faith. I will be fine wherever I go. God has blessed me. God has promised me it's going to be fine. And so therefore I will go wherever the wind takes me. I will go wherever the Lord points me. If it's toward good circumstances, fine. Toward not so good circumstances, I'll be okay with that too. And so therefore, in a very real spiritual sense, it doesn't matter what Abram does. He's going to be fine as long as he takes his faith with him. Lot, apparently at least, does not share that kind of commitment. He makes this short-term choice that winds up bringing disaster on his family. When we embrace God's future, we welcome the idea that this world is not our home, that we are going to be content wherever we happen to be, then this brings on this peace in this world when we are confident that God is going to work it out for us in one way or the other. I love the text in Hebrews chapter 11, and you're as familiar with it as I am probably. I'll read from verse number 13 and following. These all died in faith, speaking specifically about Abraham and his family, although they had not received the things that were promised, but they saw them from a distance, greeted them, and confessed that they were foreigners and temporary residents on the earth. Now, those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they were thinking about where they came from, they would have had an opportunity to return. But now they desire a better place, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. What a wonderful assurance that is, and what a wonderful example for us as we try to live our lives in faith, in a world that is not perfect, in a world that offers us short-term advantages that do not seem to be conducive to our spiritual walk. Having the faith to ignore those things, having the faith to move past them and embrace God's future, which he promises is far, far better than any future that we could have acquired for ourselves. That is the true grace. James talks in James chapter 4 about God giving us a greater grace when we have confidence in him. Whatever we are struggling for, whatever we are fighting for in this life, oftentimes to the detriment of our soul, whatever it happens to be, however wonderful it is in our mind, God can give us something better. God will give us something better if we walk in faith. Don't feel compelled to take this easy solution. Don't feel compelled to embrace a short-term blessing and even credit God for this short-term blessing, if in accepting that blessing, we're going to hurt our long-term objectives. Don't settle for Sodom. There is a much greater Eden waiting for us. Sodom may seem like a well-watered place. It may be, in fact, a well-watered place. And there are certain advantages to living in the city. I'm sure Lot took advantage of those situations. Having a nice solid roof over your head, having walls around you, not having to worry about staying through the rain or putting up a tent in high wind conditions and that sort of. There are a lot of very serious advantages to living in cities. That's why God builds us a city. That's why he's prepared a city for us. And the similarity between the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 2 and the paradise that's given to us in the end of the book of Revelation, that is not an accident. The tree of life is still there. There's still the river flowing through it. That is God's blessing for us. That is God's city. And we are privileged to be partakers of that city if we have enough faith. So don't settle for Sodom. Don't give up on God's plan just because it seems like in the short term, your own plan might work out just as well. Have faith that God is accomplishing something great in you and wait for it to be accomplished. In the meantime, serve God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. I hope that you have enough faith to reach out for this well-watered place that God has prepared for us in the future, and do not settle for what may seem in the way to be a paradise here on earth that comes part and parcel with a sinful lifestyle, or at least a lifestyle that does not characterize itself with faith. Hold out for God's city. You can do this, so can I. Thank you so much for joining. God bless.